For the past 4 Sundays of our season of giving, we've been meditating on some of the ways that we are what we make. This Sunday, we begin a new sermon series, a series that will invite us to plunge into purpose, to reflect on pillars and priorities and possibility. But before I say anything more about any of that, though, let us turn our attention to Holy Scripture. Hear these words from the New Testament, First Peter chapter 4, verses 8 through 11. Everything in the world is about to be wrapped up, so take nothing for granted. Stay wide awake in prayer. Most of all, love each other as if your life depended on it. Love makes up for practically anything. Be quick to give a meal to the hungry, a bed to the homeless, cheerfully. Be generous with the different things God gave you, passing them around so all get in on it. If words, let it be God's words. If help, let it be God's hearty help. That way, God's bright presence will be evident in everything through Jesus. And Jesus will get all the credit as the one mighty in everything. Encores to the end of time. Oh, yes. Sibling had turned against sibling. National violence had replaced public debate. Guns were everywhere. People of color were treated like property. And Memphis, Tennessee had become an epicenter of it all. This is because in 1862, Memphis had become a primary battlefront for the Civil War. After the Union had swiftly defeated the Confederate naval vessels along the Mississippi River, Ulysses S. Grant set foot in Memphis, along with hundreds of Union soldiers. These soldiers from Ohio and Massachusetts and Connecticut and elsewhere found themselves in a strange place. They walked the lengths of Main Street and Front Street and Beale Street, seeing geographies and ways of life that were totally foreign to most of them. They slept in tents and wrote letters home. They learned Southern customs and ate Southern foods. And as they sought to find a way to live in this strange new city, the Congregationalists among them decided to start a chapel. As some of these soldiers decided to turn Memphis into their new home, staying or even in some cases returning to this city after the Civil War ended, that little military chapel turned into a Congregationalist church. The first Congregationalist church, in fact, not only in Memphis, but in all of Tennessee. However, they didn't call it First Congregational, not at first. And they certainly didn't call it First Congo. No, there was something these people had in common that was even more essential to them than their denominational belonging. There was something even more powerful for them than their particular brand of Christian practice. These northern outsiders who had come south to prevent slave-owning secessionists from destroying the United States decided to name their new congregation after exactly what they were: strangers in a strange land. Yes, before there was First Congo, before there was even First Congregational, this community here was founded as Strangers Church. In a poignant twist of fate, our church is back in a kind of founding process right now. Given our changes in leadership, and our changes in demographics, and our changes in social patterns and financial structures, we are engaged in an effort to name who we are and where we are going. We are engaged, in other words, in the work of finding and founding this church all over again. And like this church's forebears, we're having to do that work in the midst of our very own version of profound national tensions and very deep divides. Just as this church's founders had to navigate the task of making church amidst oppressive structures and loud voices using nostalgia to justify tyranny, we too are having to figure out how to forge community in the face of anger, anxiety, and extraordinary fear. Like this church's forebears, many of us are looking around at our country, looking around at this state, looking around at our city, and many of us are feeling like strangers in a strange land. You know, whenever we find ourselves in the thick of change and uncertainty, whenever we wrestle with a sense of being on the outside of what seems to be the norm, we must find something we can hold on to, something that can anchor us, something that can hold us up. In the harrowing fog of transition, we must find a way, in other words, to grab hold of purpose. We may not know precisely where we are going, but in order to pick up our feet and move, any person must have some vague sense, at least, of why we are moving, why we are working, why we are trying, for instance, to make an old midtown church thrive. We must have at least a vague notion of why we are trying, for example, to make a marriage last. We need to have some sense of why we are striving for sobriety, or why we should keep up that diet, or why we should go to those appointments, or why we need to make absolutely sure to vote. If we are going to step into changing realities atop ground that feels as if it is changing too, then we must have some measure of clarity about why we can, why we must, why we should try. We need some sense of who we really are and what our purpose really is. This is why, starting in June of this past year, this church took up the task of discerning and visioning. That is, trying to see who and where we are. Blessedly, we had an incredible team of First Congoers who led us along the way. These people included Jenny Bartlett Prescott, Michael Carter, Mikhail Clemens, Fran Fields, Julia Hicks, Jackie Nairn, and Kevin Williams. This team helped craft a survey. They facilitated listening sessions. And then when all the information and all the stories and all the insights and dreams and hopes and concerns had been named, they distilled all of that down into 4 purposes, 4 pillars, if you will, that hold this community up. Will you join me in thanking these people for their work? Now, thankfully, it was a relatively simple task because the answers so many of you gave overlapped in beautifully evident ways. Firstly, it became clear that this is a church that relentlessly nurtures inclusive, diverse community. Secondly, First Congo boldly works and advocates for justice. Thirdly, we are a church that unabashedly affirms and celebrates LGBTQ spiritual seekers. Fourthly, what became clear to the visioning team is that folks come to First Congo in order to worship God with creativity and curiosity. Throughout the Sundays in November, we will take up each one of these purposes, each one of these pillars, and we'll talk about how they have and how they will continue to shape us. In other words, in November, we'll be reflecting on what we have done and what we still have left to do together. Over the past 3 decades, First Congo has come to be known as a church where everybody is welcome. We have come to be known as a place of radical hospitality, a place that embraces people just as they are, no matter what you look like, no matter where you've been, no matter how much you have, no matter whom you love. Thanks to the work of Pastor Cheryl Cornish and Pastor Sonia Walker and Julia Hicks, thanks to the work of so many of you, on any given Sunday, you can look around our sanctuary, be it in person or online, and see all kinds of people with all kinds of stories from all kinds of backgrounds. Nurturing inclusive and diverse community is a goal, is a purpose, and is blessedly a reality we get to celebrate and also keep working toward every single week. Amidst that diversity, though, there is one way that we are all alike. There was one clear theme we heard echoed among the people who filled out surveys or attended listening sessions. One attribute that the vast majority of us have in common is that we're all strangers. In one way or another, we're queer, or gay, or lesbian, or trans. We're straight folks who love a God who loves all. We're addicts, alcoholics, and 12-steppers. We're liberal Democrats among families of staunch conservatives. We're longtime Republicans who don't align with the MAGA movement. We're black folks who don't feel comfortable in the churches that shaped us. We're white folks who don't feel comfortable in the churches that shaped us. We're Hispanic and Latinx folks in search of a home. We're immigrants in search of sanctuary. We're folks in interracial families, and we are the children of mixed-race couples. We live in large houses, but aren't opposed to sharing. We live on the streets and aren't opposed to sharing. We are working class and middle class and upper class and no class. As you look around this room, as you learn the stories of the people near you, it starts to become all so clear. Even though we've changed our name since the 1860s, this is still very much a stranger's church. For the first few centuries of the Jesus movement, that is essentially what every Christian community was, a stranger's church. Before Christianity was co-opted as the religion of the Roman Empire, it was the refuge, the sanctuary, the go-to for the outcasts and the unwanted. It was the religion for strangers, for all those who refused to support oppression, for all those who refused to worship the emperor, for all those who refused to fit in. Nowadays, of course, in many places, the picture is quite different. Nowadays, certain versions of Christianity have become dominant. Despite shrinking churches and aging churches and closing churches, Christianity is still the most widely followed faith in the world. Churchgoers nowadays, in many churches, are the normal folk, the insiders, the mainstream. That was not the case, though, when the letter we know as First Peter was written. In chapter 4, the section we read today, the author names a variety of beautiful, rich, good ideas. Give food to the hungry, beds to the homeless, love as if your life depended on it. To whom was he saying this? To whom were all of these compassionate commandments written? Well, in the very first sentence of the letter, we find out. I am Peter, it begins, an apostle on assignment by Jesus the Messiah, writing to exiles, writing to strangers scattered to the four winds. This is a letter, you see, addressed to people who had been displaced, people whose lives had been disrupted, people who had been demeaned and demoralized and downcast. These commandments, then, these instructions we read today, aren't just good ideas grounded in some abstract sense of moral duty. They are instead calls to a group of people who knew at a heart level what it meant to be hungry, what it meant to be homeless, what it meant to be let down, left out, and left behind. This is a letter to and for strangers. In other words, the author of First Peter was calling his readers and listeners into a sense of religious action rooted entirely in empathy. You know that feeling, the letter seems to say, that feeling of rejection, that hunger for acceptance, that sense of drifting through the world without a home, that reality that every stranger has felt in one way or another. Don't hide from that. Our call instead is to sink into that feeling and to share the love we didn't get, to share the food we weren't offered, to make up the beds that no one made up for us. You know that sense of being strange, the letter seems to say? Rather than let that become a wound in your heart, transform that feeling into fuel for your entire spirituality. Don't try to conform to the world. Don't try to be mainstream. Be strangers and be church. From ancient Christians persecuted by an empire to Union soldiers who found themselves in a brand new city, to the motley crew of today who gathers here now, why we gather, friends, one of our deepest purposes is to love and to welcome and to include, not in spite of our woundedness, but in fact because of it. Regardless of who we are or how we look, the truth is, we all know what it means to be a stranger. We've all felt the sting of being an outcast or a misfit, and so we are called to offer abundant welcome to everybody. Because if everyone is a stranger, then no one is. When everybody can own how they're different, how they're strange, how they don't or won't fit into the molds they've been given, then we can find a whole new level of authenticity, a whole new depth of community. We can find a whole new power and love we might call God. If ever you should look around this place and find someone you don't recognize, someone you don't quite know about, someone who is a stranger, I invite you to think about a time when you felt on the outside. I invite you to connect with that sense of fear and loneliness, and then I invite you to think of this place's long, rich tradition as a church of and as a church for strangers. And finally, I invite you to follow the words of First Peter and to go love as if your life depended on it. Because the truth is, it actually just might. May it be so, and oh yes.